Hello, everyone. This is Gene Geog History, and today I'm going to do something different. And this is going to be part one of three, where I'm going to go over three racial groups or three racial mixes and talk about the groups that existed from a recent admixture or ancient admixture. And because I generally cover a lot of the Caribbean, and in that group, there's a group called the mixed race or the mulatto group that is definitely more common than the other two groups, i.e., Eurasian and Asian. I am going to delve into the mulatto populations within the world that were created by recent admixture, and by recent, I mean within the last 500 years, and ancient admixture, so groups before 500 years ago that were created. And by mulatto, I am referring to people who are roughly half sub Saharan African and half West Eurasian in ancestry and in genealogy. So I'm using those two specific terms since West Eurasian not only just includes Europe, but includes West Asia and some parts of South Asia as well, where sub-Saharan, including Africa, while sub-Saharan Africa is everything south of North Africa. So those are the two main groups that I'm referring to when it comes to the mulatto groups. So we are going to start with the recently admixed groups, and by that I'm referring to groups that were created and mixed together primarily within the last 500 years, referencing the New World generally, which is mostly commonly due to the Atlantic slave trade and colonial era migrations. So that is what I mean by recently admixed groups. Obviously, the main group of this are in the Americas, and by that I mean North and South America. And because I generally focus on the Caribbean, I'm going to talk about that group. So essentially, recently admixed groups of the Caribbean who fits this are mulatto Caribbeans. So in the Anglo world, so in places like Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Tobago, there is a mixed race mulatto group. So essentially, people that are half white and half black due to the slave trade and later intermixing post slavery, or it's just mixed race people procreating with mixed race people. They are not a majority in these Anglo Caribbean countries. Some might consider some of the Douglas groups in Trinidad and Guyana, and to a lesser extent Jamaica, to be part of this group, and a lot of South Asians are West Eurasian ancestry wise, and I believe a lot of them came from northern India. So more of that West Eurasian admixture comes from northern India compared to southern India that has more Australoid admixture. That's depending on how you see things. And it's the same thing with the Haitians, where they generally have a mulatto class as well. So people who are half white and half black, though they are francophone. So in Haiti, I believe they're called John de Couleur Libre, and they have similar admixture to the Anglo mulatto class as well. But in the francophone and anglophone Caribbean, they are in the minority. So now I want to move on to the next part, which kind of has two parts within itself. And obviously, I am referring to the Hispanic Americas or Latin America. And this has two parts. Obviously, there are the Caribbean Hispanics, and then there's Central and South American Hispanics. So I'm just going to talk about the Caribbean Hispanic first, since I talked about them already and have more knowledge on them due to my coverage of the Caribbean. So when it comes to the Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans, they all have a relatively large mixed race population. And due to the admixture in these three countries and the Hispanic Caribbean being more Afrocentric than indigenous centric compared to everywhere else in Latin America, that means these three countries and or colonies have a lot more mulatto people in it compared to the mestizos in other Latin American countries. So pretty much in Cuba, there is a strong African-European mixture, especially in Western Cuba, where there's a more mulatto population. And due to a lot more of the white Cubans leaving during the revolution to go to America, it made the main island more mulatto leaning. Puerto Rico is essentially the same thing as Cuba, where there's a lot of mulattoes on the island, though the African mixture is a bit stronger in Puerto Rico compared to Cuba, though it has a bit more indigenous admixture, making it more triracial in comparison, but there's still a decent amount of mulatto Puerto Ricans. The Dominican Republic is the obvious main standout compared to the three, where the main population on the Dominican Republic are mulattoes, since the African and the European elements are very strong in both countries and the intermixing that happened, in addition to the very small indigenous component, making them more hardcore mulatto compared to the other two. And now in this section, I am going to focus on Latin America regarding Central and South America. So we have groups like the Brazilian Mulattoes, which is a huge group in Brazil because it is the second most populous people of African descent in the world. No, I think it is the most populous place of African descent outside of Africa in the world, and all that definitely has to do with the admixtures between the Africans and the Europeans, mainly the Portuguese and the Italians, creating the mulatto group in Brazil. Though some might be considered Pardo due to the multiraciality, but I'm specifically focusing on the mulatto group in Brazil here, and they tend to be a bit more coastal compared to inland Brazilians. It's pretty much a similar story with the Colombian, Venezuelan, and Panamanian mulatto populations, where all of them definitely got a decent amount of African slaves during the slave trade, but a lot of them received immigrants from the Caribbean, especially in coastal Colombia and coastal Venezuela, where the coastal parts of those two countries are in the Caribbean, and coastal Panama, where they also got a lot of Jamaicans too. So, with a lot of these countries already having a slave population and accepting migrants from these Afro Caribbean countries, with them then mixing in with their white populations of those countries, it formed a mulatto group in these three countries. So, it's mainly in the coastal areas. Now I'm going to refer to the United States, where there are two groups, but they are similar but different. They're kind of like cousins in a way. The first group that I'm going to refer to are Louisiana Creoles, and these are descendants of people from colonial Louisiana who are multi-generationally mixed, mainly of African and European, black and white, and they are generations of uninterrupted mixing between those two groups. So those are Louisiana Creoles, and they have that admixture just never stops, just multi-generationally mixed mulattoes. That's what Creole people of Louisiana are on average, and they are one of the two groups in the United States or above Central America that I am in reference to, or I'm referencing now. Okay, so with this part, I'm only talking about a select few African Americans. Average African American is overwhelmingly Black, Sub-Saharan African, whatever term you want to use. I'm not referring to the majority in this post or in this video. I am referring to the select minority of African Americans who are multi-generationally mixed with equal European and African. So they're kind of like Louisiana Creoles, where they are multi-generationally mixed with black and white, but the difference is African Americans are from the colonial United States. Louisiana or colonial Louisiana was a separate thing. The admixture with African Americans mainly comes from British, where In Louisiana, it is French and maybe Spanish. So those are the two differences there. Also, there are some Black and Nova Scotians who either came from colonial US or they were just there in Canada, but they have similar admixtures to the select minority of African Americans. Now I am going to talk about anciently admixed groups. So these are essentially groups that mixed and became their own group before the New World was a thing. So from 500 years ago plus, but mainly thousands of years old. But there's one group that's kind of in the middle of both, so I was kind of confused as to where to place them. So the group that I was referencing when it came to being a part of both ancient and recent admixture group are Cape Verdeans. So they inhabit the island of Cape Verde, which is off the coast of northwestern Africa. It was taken over by the Portuguese people, where I think it didn't really have people on it like that. But pretty much the Portuguese took over the island, and due to it being the first step when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade, a lot of what would become African slaves would be brought there, and the intermixing between the Portuguese and the West African slaves caused for a population of mulattoes to be created there. And this group of people was formed within the 15th century, so the 1400s. So that's why it's kind of teetering on being a part of the New World and also teetering into the ancient world as well. And it got to the point where most people in Cape Verde are part of this mulatto group, where there's a lack of white and a lack of black people in it overall today. So this is essentially an island full of mixed mulatto people when it comes to having West Eurasian, i.e., Portuguese, and Sub-Saharan African, i.e., West African admixture. So next few groups have essentially the same admixture, where I'm mainly referring to Sub-Saharan African and the admixture being West Asian. Though depending on the location, some of the Sub-Saharan African admixture is West African and others is East African. But you kind of figure what I'm talking about. So the Horn of Africa represents some of the world's oldest West Eurasian and African mixtures from 10,000 to 3,000 years ago. And this is mainly due to the back migration that took place in the Horn of Africa, where the people who were originally there, since I believe humanity started in the Horn of Africa, went up to West Asia. They lived there, then they kind of became their own thing. Then they came back to the Horn of Africa to procreate with the Hasidic population that was already kind of there, or the indigenous population that was already there, creating what we now know to be the Horn of African people. And the people who came from West Asia are similar to Arabs, but the Arab religion and identity wasn't a thing yet. So they're kind of seen as pre-Arab. So when it comes to the Horn of Africa and this admixture, I'm mainly referring to people like the Ethiopians, though the main groups of this are like the Amhara and the Tigray groups from the ancient mixture of East African plus West Eurasian, often from ancient Levantine or Arabian populations. Emphasis on ancient when it comes to those two groups. Somalis, it's kind of the same thing with the East African plus West Eurasian mixture from ancient Cushitic expansions and Arabian contact. Obviously, this would translate over to Djiboutians and Eritreans as well. Another group that's similar to these two are the Oromo and the Afar people with the same admixtures. But because of this admixture being so old, and then after it was created, the all just continued to procreate with one another, they are seen as some of the most homogeneous people on Earth due to all of what I just mentioned. So this next group is right beside the Horn of Africa, but not in the Horn of Africa. And this is in reference to Sudan and the Eastern Sahel, where there is definitely ancient admixture of the Nilotic slash East African plus West Eurasians from Northeast Africa, the Nile, and the Middle East entering Sudan and the Eastern Sahel. You see this admixture within Nubians, especially in like, the main Sudan, where obviously Sudan split into Sudan and Southern Sudan within the 2010s, but the people who were in the northern end of Sudan had a lot more of that Arab admixture, and due to the Arabs kind of um, invading Sudan, which inevitably caused those countries to split, that was more modern. But the admixture that came from these two groups were very, very ancient, and it's just natural due to its proximity not only to Egypt but to the Horn of Africa. And it's essentially the same thing with the Biha group, who are also in the Eastern Sahel. So I'm going to kind of just merge this final group together. And essentially, I'm going to talk about the Western Sahelian populations, and this also includes some North African groups, but the ones in the Sahara. So the southern, the most part of North Africans, they tend to be a lot more admixed with a lot more sub-Saharan African DNA compared to the average North African, especially in the urban areas. And with this, we also have the Western Sahelian groups of people, like the Fulanis, who have significant West Eurasian related ancestry with sub Saharan admixture, and it's one of the clearest ancient Afro Eurasian blends. They tend to be in places like northern Nigeria, Niger, and places like that because it's essentially in the Sahara. It's the same thing with the Northern Hausa people when it comes to the Eurasian related North African admixture. And we do see this in the Tuareg people too, who is all over the Western Sahara, or, or the Western Sahelian populations with the same admixture of North African plus West African from very ancient admixture. So the final thing that I'm going to do for this video is to really narrow down 3 to 4 groups of people. The first set from the recently admixed groups, and the second will be from the distantly admixed groups that are closest to the 50-50 West Eurasian and Sub-Saharan African. So who fit the perfect amount being split between those two. So literally 50% Sub-Saharan African and 50% West Eurasian. I'm going to find the groups within both recent and ancient that fit that category, and we're going to break it down. So the first recently admixed group who perfectly fits the 50-50 equilibrium are Cape Verdeans. So they are on average 50% West African and 50% Portuguese. So this admixture dates to the 1400s to the 1700s. That's kind of where the original mixing started. And then afterwards, they essentially became their own people, and Cape Verdeans after this Mulatto, and the multi-generational mixing just continued till today, where they are the majority. So the population was literally founded through repeated African Portuguese mixing, and they are the closest large population today that has a stable 50-50 ratio. The second group that fits this on average are Louisiana Creoles of color, and the difference between them and Cape Verde is that Cape Verdeans are the majority in their country, while Louisiana Creoles are not. And that's for a plethora of reasons, and some of them don't even really involve race, but mainly linguistic ties and a bunch of other stuff. So, on average, they are 45 to 55% African and 45 to 55% European. And the European tends to be French or Spanish, but it could also be British as well. But you do see that there's a variance, as there are some people who are like 55% African and 45% European, and others who are 45% African and 55% European. So it's not the perfect 50-50, but it's generally the closest. Though modern Creole, so the ones born in these recent generations, fly a lot more on average, but historically, they are closer to near 50-50. So at number three are Afro-European populations in the Caribbean. So essentially, there are mulatto classes in the Caribbean. I've talked about this in a few videos, especially with the mulatto class in Jamaica. But you also see this with the Haitian mulatto elite, who are often 40 to 60% European and African. The Dominican Republic, essentially, this is the average though. There are some who are closer to the 50-50%, though I do think it varies a bit more. And the mulatto class in Cuba essentially are roughly around the 40 to 60% range of both European and African. So, what I wanted to point out here is that these are subgroups, not entire nations, which is why they are lower, and they're also generally the minority in, I guess, outside the Dominican Republic in their countries. And at fourth are multi-generationally mixed African Americans. So I want to clear this up. The average for African Americans is nowhere close to 50-50%, but there are subsections and subpopulations that are essentially mulatto and are 50-50. So places like Virginia, South Carolina, essentially the DVM region, and some places in Louisiana. They are roughly around 40 to 60% African and 40 to 60% European. I do want to mention that they are different from Louisiana Creoles, as Louisiana Creoles are descendants of the originating people of Louisiana before it was a part of the United States, where African Americans are descendants of the people who were in the United States or who were on that land before it became the United States. So there is that discrepancy between those two, and they're not to be correlated as the same thing. So with the African Americans that I mentioned here, they are a very, very, very small subpopulation within the African American group. But as a whole, African Americans do not fall under this category. So, regarding the ancient and mixed populations that are closest to 50-50, regarding 50% Sub-Saharan African and 50% West Eurasian, we do have the Horn of Africa Highland group. So, these are mainly Ethiopian highland groups of the Amhara, Tigray, and some Oromo groups of people. The typical average between these people are 40 to 55% ancient West Eurasian, which is mostly Levantine slash Arabian or pre those populations, and 45 to 60% East African. So these groups are the closest ancient population that are closest to 50 to 50% on Earth. So just overall, if you want to look at an ancient and mixed group that fits this the best, this group is it, and they are the highest in that regard. So the second closest group to that 50-50 ratio are the Fulani, mainly in the west slash central Sahel. They're not nearly as close as the group that I just mentioned, but the average admixture is typically 35 to 55% West Eurasian related. So this is mainly like North African, and the West African admixture is from 45 to 65%. So there's a lot more variance within the region, though some are definitely extremely close to 50-50%. Another group that is closest, hence them being number three on list, are Afro-Asiatic Cushitic Bija. So these are people in Sudan and Eritrea, and Eritrea is part of the Horn of Africa, but I guess they are the closest to Sudan, so it makes sense why they're kind of grouped together. So the average admixture here is 40 to 55% West Eurasian related ancestry coming from the same source, and 45 to 60% East African, so obviously from the native East Africans. Of course, it's extremely close to the 1-to-1 ratio, though there's more variance compared to the other two, hence them being at number three. So the fourth group is the Tuareg, and I'm specifically focusing on the northern Tuareg, so that's kind of where North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa blend together. So it's a very select group in the Tuareg. So with some groups in this area, their admixture ranges from 30 to 50% restoration. So this comes from the North African slash Ibero-Mauritian plus later Near Eastern admixture. and 50 to 70% Sub-Saharan African. And this is mainly West African due to the direct being on the western end of the continent. So they essentially cluster around the 45 to 55% ratio in some regions. Alrighty, so that concludes my video on the mulatto groups or mulatto-like groups based on recently admixed and anciently admixed groups. I'm going to do the same video for the Eurasian equivalent, so the East Eurasian and West Eurasian admixture groups. And I'm also going to do the same thing with the Blasian and mixed groups. So Sub-Saharan African plus East Eurasian and mixed groups. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye.